RYA courses and qualifications. From beginners to professionals, with more than 100 courses to choose from, there's something for everyone. Visit rya.org.uk to learn more.
Welcome to a very special conversation where we go behind the medals, some of the moments and the mindsets that have shaped British Olympic sailing over the decades. The first Olympic regatta was actually on the River Seine in the 1900s. The first of 63 Olympic sailing medals our nation has won. Today, I am delighted to be joined by three legends who have helped shape, build and steer Olympic sailing over the years as athletes, coaches and leaders. First to introduce is Keith Musto OBE, a trailblazer of British Olympic sailing, winning a silver medal back in the Flying Dutchman in 1964 in the Tokyo Olympics. I'm also joined by Carr CBE. Carr was the leading figure in British sailing, best known for transforming the RYA Olympic programme from the underdog to the world-leading high-performance system that we know of today. And finally, we have Carr CBE. Widely known as Sparky, he was the driving force behind some of the nation's most successful Olympic sailing campaigns. As the RYA Olympic manager, he led the sailing team through 4 Olympic and Paralympic cycles, being the most successful Olympic sailing nation in the world. So to kick us off, it's such an esteemed panel. I have to be really careful that I stay on target here so we have the conversation, because I'm excited to talk to you all. But I'm really keen to know what first pulled each of you into the Olympic sailing world. Was there a moment, and what made it become your passion and your purpose? And I think, Keith, we should start with you.
I think it all started at the Royal Corinthian Yacht Club at Burnham-on-Crouch when I was sailing a cadet, and Captain Haylock, who was the founder of the cadet class, stood up at the start of the week and told us how lucky we were to have the facilities of the Corinthian at our disposal and how we must take care of it. He then went on to say that we were the future of British sailing. We were the future of Olympic sailors sailing, and could be, therefore, the gold medal winners. And somehow, something sticks in your mind now and again, and that stuck. I had no dreams or thoughts. I barely knew the rules, let alone thought about sailing abroad outside of Benfleet Creek. And that's really how my dream, I suppose, started.
That's fascinating that actually it was an influence of somebody else. And we often talk about the impact that coaches and teachers and leaders have and how it influences us. Well, a man who likes a challenge, and you could say, Sparky, that you kind of lapped up the golden years. That Athens 2004 for 4 cycles, we were at the top of the pile, but that's a difficult place to be. But your passion must have come before that.
Yes, I mean, I was fortunate. You speak of people that inspire. I was fortunate to be brought up on the west coast of Scotland, just west of Glasgow, at Helensburgh Sailing Club, and so of course I had people like Mike McIntyre to live up to, but plenty of other great sailors and lots of other classes. And then I was one of, if you like, that group of people that came through a time when the RY had initiated and were pushing hard on the youth squad programme. So I was a member of the Scottish youth squad and then the British youth squad, which of course at that time was being led by Jim Saltonstall, who of course was inspiring plenty of people into that space. And at the same time, as then going through from mirror dinghies right through 420s, 470s, tornado catamarans, was training to be a coach in Glasgow. So I did an undergraduate degree in sport, and then ultimately went on to be the national racing coach in Wales, through the time that I was sailing. Of course, back then, most of the people involved in sailing still had to have full-time jobs, so it was quite a change. I'm sure we'll get on to it, but quite a change from that to in the pre-lottery days, when in Scotland, you'd be driving down from Scotland on a Friday night, sleeping in your car, trying to do an open weekend, maybe at Warsash Sailing Club or whatever, and then driving home over Sunday night to get back to work on a Monday. And then that ran right into the tail end of '96, and at that time, there was when I joined the Olympic program, working for and with Rod, and with other fantastic colleagues at that time in the pre-lottery years, just immediately prior to lottery funding coming on board in '97. And I suppose the rest is history. I was very fortunate that we had some great mentors in that space. And I think one of the reasons why we had some fantastic success year on year is we had some great transition and a great ability with different skill sets to be able to pass on good knowledge and continuity between what Rod was doing, leading as the chief coach initially, and then the Olympic director, to John Derbyshire, who was the Olympic manager prior to myself. And then when Rod became CEO and John moved on to be the racing manager, and I took over as Olympic manager just after the Sydney Games. So I suppose I had some good and at time firm hands on my tillers to make sure I was going in the right direction. So as one of my very good friends and Chris Scowers, our head coach through a lot of years, and is still working within the British sailing team, would say, it's better lucky than good.
I like that philosophy. And it's funny because you allude to how funding changed, and you remember stories of driving the length of the country to come and do a regatta, to get your scores in, to then drive back and go to work. Keith, that was very much how you were an Olympic athlete, wasn't it? Take us back to 1964 and talk to us about your training, your travel, and how your team operated in the Flying Dutchman.
It's a long time ago, but I guess after the cadet incident, I was lucky enough to be offered a fin to sail for 3 years. But it was in the very early days of fins, when you had wooden masts and wooden booms that slotted through the mast, and it was banged in with a wedge. And you had cotton sails, etc. I was far too light for a fin at 10.5 stone. Elstrom called me the English flea weight, which I felt was quite a compliment, actually. The trouble is, the races always finished on a beat. And therefore it was a bit of a struggle. Having been lent it for 3 years, opened my eyes to the fact that in the UK we had lots of very, very good sailors, but none seemed to be interested in Olympic programs. So my goal was to try to encourage sailors to join the Olympic classes. And one of the teams that I worked on was Terry Wheeler and Tony Morgan, who won the Hornet Worlds. And then eventually, after a little bit of bullying and persuading, I brought an old Flying Dutchman, Lady Claire, and started to sail that. Sadly, Terry found the requirements of work and his social life were too much to allow him to continue with an Olympic campaign. Tony Morgan said, "Well, you got me into it, you better come and sail it." None of us had any money. I think Lady Claire had a main jib and spinnaker that came with the purchase. It was a very old boat, and we worked hard at it. Being very light, I remember going out with Tony one day and at Whitstable, where Doc Horan lent us his Flying Dutchman and insisted that we went for a sail in it. And it was about force 2. And Tony went to pull the Genoa in and said, "This is ridiculous. It's far too big for us." And he was basically right. But by studying photographs of Hans and Paul sailing in the worlds, etc., and looking at the techniques, you realise that weight was a problem, but it wasn't a deciding factor. Therefore, it was a matter of saying, right, we've got to get fit. And we went to the local gym one evening at school and told the trainer what we wanted. He put us through a set of exercises, which basically are what we now know as circuit training, and said, if you do that between now and 64, you'll win. Well, he wasn't quite right, but we did follow his instructions every day, Christmas Day, Boxing Day, New Year's Day, etc. And it paid off.
A silver medal from a bit of circuit training. Rod, do you think that would have carried it back in when you took the Olympic team to the 1984 Olympics?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, since that time, and of course, one of our great sailors, Rodney Patterson, who's a contemporary of Keith, won 2 golds and a silver. There were 6 classes in those days, and they were all the laser wasn't being sailed. There was no manufacturer's one design, so the classes were all subject to being exploited technically, and Britain was very good at that. Had very good sail makers, mast makers, boat builders, etc. So on the wings of that, we, in a way, I think we punched above our weight. We usually got 1 or 2 medals, Reg White, Keith, and Rodney in particular. But what was happening in continental Europe and the Eastern Bloc in particular, they had bought, they were doing exactly what Keith was doing in the training and so on and so forth. They were doing it full time. And in France, Italy, Spain, I remember, the US, because they were well off young sailors in the US at that time. In 84, there were 6 classes and the US won gold and silver in every one. Right. So we won 1 bronze, again in Flying Dutchman, because, there's some legacy going on there, but we were getting overtaken by people, nations that were putting a real effort into, and the classes were becoming more one design. There were more provided boats at the games. So there wasn't enough that played to our strengths of exploiting the technical variances that were used to be, well, they've always been available. And that's got, I'll, maybe come back to this, but that's got even more pronounced as the classes have changed. So it's now a preponderance of manufacturers' one designs, which has increased the jeopardy of whether you could, there were times when Reg, White and a Tornado, Keith, Rodney, whatever, would just be faster. All right. Now that, and that takes a lot of understanding and skill. But times moved on over the 40 years, and the gains available technically, which was our traditional strength and still is, were not as big as they used to be. That was the game in those days. So up until, I would say, we were hanging on by our coattails, the skin of our teeth, should I say, in the years between 80 and the lottery, right, in the late 90s. We were hanging in there, just about. If it had been a cross-country race, you score a team in a cross-country, it's how many you can get more or less in quite a good position, whether you won it or not, we were very good at cross-country racing, right? Very rarely in a fleet of, say, 40, did our sailors come outside the top 10. And very rarely did we medal. So we had the people who, what I call it, are in the medal zone, nearly there, but they couldn't finish it off to beat a preponderance of full-time sailors in that era. So
that's super interesting. And that whole we were almost but not quite, and that funding and commitment just took us to the next level. Keith, back in your day, I don't want to be derogatory for that at all, but old school campaigns, when it was as pure as it was, do you think there's lessons that can be learned for today's sailors? You know, from stuff that you went through, that tenacity, that resilience, that grit, that, you know, you had to do it all yourself.
Rod touched on it there, that today the classes basically are give you a handbook on how to set it up and train it and tune it. We were lucky. It was so basic. I remember the introduction of the Cunningham hole in the mainsail. And a person who I learned a lot from when I mentioned it couldn't understand what I was talking about. That's how basic it all was. I developed the universal tiller joint from falling out of the fin, trying to emulate Paul's smooth, speedy roll tacking in his fin. All I succeeded doing was breaking the tiller extension, and therefore had to find a way around it. Hence the universal tiller joint, which we developed. Novex blocks and other bits and pieces of equipment that were around then were the first ratchet blocks, and we started to realise how to use them. I don't think the sailors of today have the challenge of finding out how to improve themselves, partly because so much improvement has been made, and the limit is very high on going further.
Well, I think a lot of that improvement has been down to yourself and your contemporaries as well. So we're very grateful for that. Rod, if I take you back to Los Angeles, because 2028 we're going to return there. But back in 1984, when you were there, that one bronze medal, that medal ceremony you witnessed, it was a bit of a kind of a light that shone for you about using the games as a driver for change with the British team. What was that spark for you there?
Well, it was a pretty depressing time, and anybody that's not done well at a major competition, I'd only been involved for 2.5 years. But to come back and reset, there was a number of things that we started to do, and there wasn't much strategy in the whole approach. And you could say, well, there wasn't much money. How can you have a strategy? Well, that's kind of understandable. Nor had the RYA got a lot of leverage, because, the grants were minimal, the travel grants were minimal, and relied on people putting a lot of their own money into things. So you had to try and persuade people, about the right course of actions. I've always been a very strong believer in the coach's job is to transfer, to help with the setup of the new class coming from mirrors or 420s or whatever, just have a brain dump, mass rake is this, etc., because it just shortens the learning curve. But then to try and help people to actually manage their own campaigns, like Keith did. And I think that lesson of the great sailors of the past, Rodney, Keith, Reg, etc., is still a great model for the future, except they didn't have, nowadays, as Keith said, you don't have to go through all that boring stuff, because one is the manufacturers want designs, and isn't the variability to get into all that anyway. And so to just set the youngster up, I'm talking about a youngster, teenager, university age student, because by and large they're not going to win, they're not going to medal unless you're Ben Ainsley, who's pretty unique, until your mid-20s. So you need that maturity. And my sort of aim is to, once they've learnt their trade and once they're starting to show promise, not in their own terms, because you need that confidence. Yeah, I can do this, Rod. Yeah, fine. Shows the results. And once they start to progress, and Sparky and I were working on to give back the power of the managing the campaign to the sailor. I mean, it's their campaign. It's not like football team where you've got to agree whether you're going to play 3-4-2 or 5-4-1 and all that. It's their campaign. They've got to make those decisions, not only on the water, but about everything to do with the campaign. So I'm and if you look back at our recent success, those people actually manage. I mean, other sports are amazed how much independence and how much credence we give to the sailors themselves, up until the fact that in the end of the day, if you've got past medals, by and large, you choose your coach, just like a tennis player does, right? I mean, you look at Raducanu, has different coaches every 3 months, and so and golfers and so on and so forth. So I think that I've always been very keen to, and that harks back to Keith's experience. If you take away that, if you spoon feed the sailor, I think you miss out. They're not as resilient as they would be if they were, as it were, spoon fed, like you would do a junior sailor. That's fine when you're 15, but it's not fine when he's 25.
Be part of a worldwide community of over 100,000 people and enjoy exclusive benefits while protecting the activities we love. RYA membership, your route to expert advice. Become a member today.
Yeah, and that relationship is so important. The fact that they choose their coach, they need to have people they relate to. And I think back, so we had a 96 Olympics was, I think overall we finished 36th in the medal table, which is crazy now when we go into the Olympics with the expectations that we have.
Yeah.
We had silver medals for Ben Ainsley and John Merricks and Ian Walker, so sailing had the spotlight. But it was that following year where the National Lottery funding came in that was the biggest game changer. And I can only just imagine the conversations that you guys would have had with John Derbyshire about how you were going to spend the money and what needed to happen.
Yeah. We saw it coming. I mean, so I'm getting lined up in my head who's a promising young coach. Sparky was doing a great job in Wales, but he had very wide responsibilities. And so to try and recruit people of that caliber with that potential was one of the first things. The other thing to do was to maximise our grant from the Sports Council. I mean, it's a government quango, which I was honoured to lead with UK Sport in the end a few years later. But the reality is, sailing's an arcane sport with its own language. You can't, just like I suppose equestrianism is as well. But unless you pitch what you are going to do in the language of the civil servants, you're not going to get very far. It's ever so easy to say, oh, you don't understand, which they don't, because it's very, very different to the popular major British sports. So what we did was to employ somebody that worked for Sport England, okay, who got it, understands, no, you can't do that, and helped. I mean, it went on. I'm going to say that they worked for the RAA, but they'd had 10 years working for Sport England, creating pathways for all different sports. So that was very helpful, to say the least. And when you went before the board and you wrote the paper, which included putting money into national centres of excellence, Largs, Pwllheli, Weymouth and Hayling, right? That's what other sports do. So they just got a tick. That was easy. Yeah, okay, how much? All right, because other sports did that. And so we hadn't done it. We got the money to do it. And, those centres are still working well, I think. So, but it was just having somebody who spoke the language on our side that enabled us to land a big. And I mean, my budget in '96, from memory, was about £500,000. All right. And in those monies went up in '97 to 4 million. Right. That was the scale of the money coming into the sport, our sport, at all levels. I mean, not just the Olympic team, the youth and so on and so forth. So pretty big change.
Well, a huge change. And for you, Sparky, that was fast, enthusiastic investment that you got to kind of run with, literally. So what did that lottery funding make possible that wasn't even on the radar before? Where did you see the biggest gains for progress when you kind of took that funding and worked with it?
I think the biggest changes were around the ability for people to sail full time. There were very few people that were able to sail full time. If you look back at, as Rod said, there were some fantastic performers over the years. I thought when he was talking about Los Angeles, he was going to mention the fact that, for example, we had Kathy Foster, who was actually racing before we even had women's events, won a race, I think, in LA with Pete Newland.
She did, yeah.
In the 470, second in the women's worlds. But you then, when they went on to 96, when you looked at Johnny Merricks and Ian Walker, Ben Ainsley, they were some of the very few sailors that actually had some private sector support that was allowing them to sail full time in that sector. I was, we were kind of, we were thinking about how do we manage by agreement. Roger used to speak about a lot, with the campaigns and with the sailors in that space, and with John, Rod, and I thinking about how we're going to put together that first bid for '96, and it is that change, that seismic change. I look back today to see what the award was for the RYA for the 2000 games. It was just less when I started, which was before lottery, with Rod, with Jim Saltonstall, with Bill Edgerton, with John, Barry Edgington. That was a staff cohort, spending just under £500,000. I think it was £485,000 at that time. The 2000 budget in total was £11,005,000. Today it's just short of £24 million in terms of the investment into the Olympic sailing and Olympic sailing pathway. So the ability to be able to provide regularity of training camp, to be able to provide the support and the training, to be able to get into the circuit training that Keith was talking about. It used to be that we would go maybe once a year to Chichester University, which was where the sports medicine program initiated at that time. again, prior to this, we were quite good at getting some money, but I think that whole piece around learning quite quickly what was the game and how did you get into winning the game? What were the pieces? How did you place your pieces on the board to be able to maximise the opportunity that we could get to drive that income into the program? But then how could we then set up? So that was around being really clear around target, around trying to inspire people correctly, around trying to lead them to manage their own programs, but also still then, trying to support where we could the individual campaigns, because particularly those classes that hadn't yet moved to being manufacturers one design classes, there was a huge amount of work involved in optimizing that equipment, as Keith outlined earlier. And of course, it became more and more expensive as people were traveling around the world. So it wasn't unusual by the time we got into the sort of Athens, Beijing cycles for people to have 4 boats, to have a boat, in transit, a boat in the Mediterranean somewhere, one boat in the UK. And of course, it took a couple of months for the boats to get from A to B. But these sailors at that time were now sailing every single week. So you'd be racing in the air, you'd come back, and a couple of days later, you'd be back in Portland racing around Weymouth Bay or getting ready for your next event. So having the support staff around in place and then helping provide that continuity of training and that intensity of ability to compete, both race and compete and train, was the biggest shift, I think, from
and the other thing, I think, first of all, the numbers that Sparky mentioned there were over a 4-year cycle, so divide the 25 million by 4. The other thing I think is that don't want to give the impression that we're a bunch of far-sighted geniuses, working it out quicker than anybody else, because we weren't. And we were looking at other nations and how they did what they did. As now, other nations are looking at us. That has posed different prop issues for us and opportunities. But the other thing we had was we used to have an Olympic committee, the typical sports governing body, which had a representative of every Olympic class who banged on about their class. When you actually looked at them, I looked, because I used to be the civil servant, dutifully taking the minutes, and I'm looking around the table and nobody had ever come in the top 3 at the World Championship on that committee at that time. Nobody. And nobody had won a medal on that committee at that time. Neither had I. But we set up a thing called the Olympic Steering Group, all right, which didn't answer to anybody. The terms of reference, they answered to the ROA Council, i.e. the head body. Nothing ever got, except the terms of the trial, nothing ever got referred to them. So they were the gatekeeper. They were the people that kept Sparky and I and John and they made sure that we were going off on one. And they were very experienced sailors. Nearly all of them had got a top 3 in their respective class in the worlds, at least, if not an Olympic medal, like Mike was the chair of it for a while. And so that actually was quite challenging, quite rightly, for us as the staff people that are working all the time. It's just like a company board, frankly, and I think that was a good thing that we did. And because you can get, Sparky and I would agree something, you go, oh, that's easy, then we'll carry on. But no, big issues you had to take to the meeting, and they had comments and input, and it was based on real life experience on the circuit. So that was I thought that was a good thing that we did.
But also to your point, Rod, around, and Keith was talking about this in terms of people managing their own campaign. So that we certainly went through quite a few years where the sailors themselves had to present their campaign to the Olympic steering group. So they would work with coaches, they would work with the staff, they would put together the campaign. But this whole principle that Rod was talking about the sailors had to own their campaigns. They ultimately had to go and present to the campaign, which required them to have a lot of different skills, maybe not the skills that they required for sailing, because they were effectively presenting a business case for investment. And the Olympic Steering Group were then validating the investment that as staff members we were be proposing to them that they should be investing in the individual campaigns. So that piece around ownership of their own campaign, and the fact that they had to have some skin in the game, they had to invest in their own campaign, remembering that even with the great influx of cash into the program, that it was still a participation program. This was participatory funding, so it's a grant towards their campaign. So the sailors themselves still had to be quite ingenious about how they were actually going to be able to fund their campaigns over the course of the year, because in very few cases did the lottery funding actually meet all of the costs.
And that process that you guys put the sailors through, it was the golden era of all the names that we remember, the Shirley Robertson, the Ben Ainsley, Paul Goodison, Andrew Simpson, Ian Percy. But those soft skills where they were presenting their business case to the steering group, and they were dealing with sponsors, they were dealing with the finances, all these skills that they could take on with them, which is why they're probably in big campaigns now. So, you're actually enhancing the athlete as a whole through that process.
Yeah, and probably the next biggest thing I think was it was in venue training, because we were then in a position where we were able to support in venue training. The first games after the introduction of lottery funding was the Sydney Games, and so therefore we were able to be in a position to afford to rent houses for 3, 4, 5 months at a time. We were able to have a base there. That was when I suppose we initiated having those Olympic bases, not just for the year of the campaign. I mean, I think Rod did something very similar in Atlanta, down in Savannah. There was a big house in Savannah there, but that big change, and also the in-depth analysis of venues, so in terms of the number of staff that were able to be involved in those campaigns. I remember in Sydney in 2000, I was rooming with Hamish Wilcox, and Hamish Wilcox, of course, has until the last Cup has been working in the America's Cup on the Met program, having been one of the world's top 470 sailors back in the day with David Barnes. But there was that level of people that were involved with what we were doing. We had top level meteorologists, and the technology that we were deploying at that time in that space was as good as anywhere else, when the Met Office and the technology that was coming at the Met Office was still considered to be the best in the world. So that was definitely a big point as we went through into Athens, and for sure into Beijing, where when we went to the Far East became more and more difficult countries for people to be able to access and be able to utilize the experience, the local knowledge, if you like, in that space.
You'll know, and not to beat around the bush, none of the three of us were involved in Marseille. I would make 2 comments about. First of all, with the new Olympic format, there's a lot more jeopardy in trying to win a medal, a lot more. And you can say what you like about whether we can all, have our own opinions, but they're the rules. And so we have to adapt to those rules. Secondly, on the back of that, you might think that UK sport, by the way, I wasn't the chair at the time, and, UK sport might have gone, well, they've had a good run, let's substantially cut their grant. But they didn't. And the reason is that they have got the program, sailing's program has got a very high regard with a number of other sports. I mean, cycling being one of them, but it's got a really high regard because they can see the consistency of approach and what's the insight that that sailing traditionally has brought to that. So even though we had a bad one, and that's one factor. And the other factor is that other countries are not trying to support 10 classes because they don't have the money, they don't have the base of sailors who can compete. So they'll go for 2 or 3 classes and spend their whatever it is on to. So gone are the days where everybody tried to get participation in the games and a person from every class for every country in the games. Increasingly, countries like Holland, Belgium, the Scandi countries or whatever are going, where do we stand a chance? Oh, in this class or that class and the other. And they put all their money into that. So when you're sailing against them, if they're well organised, we no longer, in many areas, do we have a financial advantage. So we've lost our technical advantage. I say lost it. We haven't got the margin that we used to have. Secondly, a sailor is sailing against the top 10, say, in their class, which are equally supported to our sailors. So that's quite, and the jeopardy of the system. Of the thing is, you've only got to talk to Emma Wilson to know what happened to her, and so it's adapting to those rules, those new realities. That's it never stops. It's just always changing, and what worked in 2000 not going to work, in LA, except you've always got to go right.
You wouldn't want to be that person making the responsible decisions now, because it's only getting harder.
It is getting harder.
That's the same, of course, in most of the very competitive sports. The margins between first and fourth are arguably far smaller in a lot, certainly between first and 10th. Even if you had a few exceptional sailors at the top end, the margins are smaller because all the low-hanging fruit has gone either through the evolution of the boats, as Keith was talking around, from just standard one designs of development classes through to manufacturers one designs, that they've evolved, or just actually by the fact that, as Rod was mentioning, that other countries have looked in to see what Great Britain was doing in those early noughties and has pushed through on that space. I mean, we worked hard to develop squads in our program. That's been historically very successful, and probably through that pathway program of our junior squads and our youth squads has developed a cohort that's created that upward pressure to keep our top sailors honest, but also have successive sailors coming through, good training partners, the ability to have high quality domestic training as we've come through. So that's going to be a challenge. And in fact, somebody recently sent me a message saying, did you see the results from such and such an international regatta? All of the people that won a medal were coached by British coaches from all countries.
Yeah.
Right. So it wasn't responding to the British results. This was results from every medalist from every country was actually coached by a British coach. So we've got that challenge where some of our very best coaches, very best managers, very best ologists are being poached either by other British sports, which is one thing. We can maybe just about deal with that, and other countries. And indeed, when we go to Los Angeles for the next Olympics, the Olympic team manager for the USA in the home country is British, Marcus Lynch.
Yeah, it's when you produce the best, everyone who wants access to them, and I guess they're going to go to the best price. I'm just thinking, Keith, listening to this development, I mean, it's a sport you're passionate about, so it makes you happy. But imagine being in Tokyo with a training partner, with a venue analysis and all the data. Just think what your campaign could have looked like.
I've been chuckling here, pondering exactly that point. I don't remember us having a team meeting throughout the whole program whilst in Enoshima. We certainly didn't have a backup boat. Our boat was, Lady C was shipped out in, I suppose, June, maybe July, to Tokyo. We had nothing to sail in between that and the start of the games. We had no tune-up boat to work with when we were out there. There was no support whatsoever. You were on your own. And you look at the support today and you think, wow, that's quite something.
Probably a pivotal moment in Olympic history is your home Olympics. And I think 2012 was a pretty special moment. London 2012, we obviously sailed at Weymouth. Keith, were you there for the Olympics?
Yeah.
Did you watch?
Was I there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I was there as a volunteer, doing my job of serving the hierarchy with their food.
I
You were
love
very
that.
good,
People
Keith.
had no idea that they're in Olympic royalty in their volunteer.
Yeah. No, that was
Sparky,
great.
you were
I mean,
leading the team then. Sorry, Rod.
to see 10,000 people on the nose, which we got considerable stick for. I mean, I'd resigned, I'd left the OA, retired from the OA at that stage, and there's a bunch of Olympians running the regatta, but with a neutral hat on, silently cheering, of course, but with a neutral hat on. And one of the things that we were asked by the World Sailing was they wanted a medal race, in the modern format, and they wanted it to be close to the shore and the end and the place that you could overlook, and that was on that mound outside Weymouth Harbour. And so we worked hard, very hard, and it wasn't popular amongst many of the sailors, and they let us know because it introduced a lot of jeopardy into where they. So that was interesting, but to see 10,000 people cheering, that was pretty special.
Yeah, that was a heart in the mouth moment.
Huge jeopardy that was made significant differences in the outcome. As we went through that event in London, Ian Percy and Andrew Simpson looked certain to win the gold. Halfway up the first beat of the medal race, they were miles ahead in winning gold, and ultimately won the silver medal. Where everyone bet their mortgage they were going to win gold running into that race. And equally, Ben Ainslie had it all to do running into that race. He did a really tough event. Had some injuries with his back. If you remember, he had one or two interactions with his Danish competitor, and actually, it took some luck, some good judgment, some good positioning, and it was literally that final point that managed to get him that fifth gold medal. So it was jeopardy on both ways for Britain as well as for other nations.
As a leader of the team, Sparky, for 2012, was there extra pressure in preparing the athletes for home games?
Yeah, I think there is always extra pressure for home games. I think one of the challenges through that period is the concerns around positive discrimination, actually, where we were so determined as a nation to put on the best and the fairest Olympic Games ever. The concern that actually the potential home advantages were being taken away at every turn. That said, I think with the support of RY Council, and that we managed to get some great commercial partnership in the 8 years running into that Games, we managed to invest in our own accommodation facility down in Portland, which meant that we did have our own base, our own accommodation base, but also our own training base, and somewhere that we could prepare all the equipment and the boats, both of which still exist today and provide a great asset and a legacy from the Games, as well as the development of the Weymouth and Portland Sailing Academy, which Rod and Keith have both been heavily involved with over the course of the years. So I think there's been some huge legacy. To be in that position where you've got people who are racing on that race course each time, did create huge pressure. For some of the teams, still a relatively young team, probably some of the results there have driven other performers. I actually met Hannah the other day, who won a silver medal in the 470 with Saskia, Hannah Mills, and Saskia Clark won the silver medal. I think looking back on it, they'd probably say they probably should have won the gold medal in London, and probably that's what drove them to then go on and win their gold medal. And of course now she's the most successful female sailor in Olympic history. yeah, there was some highs and some lows in that campaign for sure.
And that the strategy of the current strategy, and I'm not sure whether it's still current, is to try and be in the medal zone in the last day or two of the Olympic regatta in every single class, because there's so much jeopardy now in the race format and where you're going to hold the thing. So if you are Belgium with supporting three classes, say, that's really hard, to come away with 3 medals, even though they're absolutely top sailors, because of the format and the proximity to the shore for the medal race, etc., and the points and all that. So in order to do as well as the British nation expects the sailors to do, you need to be, if it's possible, to have 10 people, there's now 10 classes, there or thereabouts, punching that, then that will deliver what has hitherto, 3 to 5 medals.
Yes, I think that over the years, it would, I think it would be fair to say that you can expect to win 50% of the number of medals that you feel that you've got a realistic chance of winning. And by realistic chance of winning, for me, that would be somebody who has actually won a medal at a world or European championships in the 2 years running into the games. So that would give them the background to be in the right place. But then they actually then have to, as Rod says, if you've got 10 classes, as we did then, 10 classes running, you need 10 if you want to win 5 medals, you need to have 10 that are fighting out going into that final day. So you're just trying to spread your bets. And I think that will, if it's not the strategy, maybe it needs to be considered as events become more and more jeopardy across all Olympic sports. But as we see it within sailing, shorter races, one-off shooting, you've got to decide whether you're willing to accept the territory exists. It's outlined by the IOC. You choose whether you want to race or not. If you don't, go and do something else. If you do, that's what's required. That does mean that on any given day you may not be the person that wins. So for the country to do well, you need to have people that are competitive across all disciplines, and that means continue to support athletes and people to support those athletes across all those different disciplines.
The evolution of Olympics is very media driven now. Like, we want the coverage and it needs to appeal to a wide audience. And sailing is quite a technical niche sport. And as you say now, with the format to meet these needs, we're often on a race course with fickle breeze, doesn't deliver to the sailors, but it delivers to the camera crew, shall we say. And now the medals are up in the air. Your personal opinion on this, is that right or wrong for the sport? Is it right or wrong for the Olympics? How do we deal with this going forwards?
I suppose my thought on it is that from a personal level, I probably preferred it back in Keith's day, because I think we had some fantastic, and we still do have some fantastic engineers working in the marine industry in the UK, and the opportunity to evolve and develop equipment is something that's perhaps built into the British maritime psyche. However, that said, I do think that it's really important that sailing remains within the Olympic programme. I think that the amount of investment that it brings to world sailing to be able to continue to deliver and run the sport and stay in the public eye is important, and therefore things will change and society will change, and actually the needs and wants of young athletes coming through the programme will change, and so we just have to accept that is the way. I mean, I suppose I often also think that they haven't put a water jump halfway up the 100 metres, and it seems to survive pretty well as an Olympic sport. And so therefore, where we can have some continuity from games to games actually provides a benefit to the universality of the sport, the number of countries that can actually get involved, because it just takes a long time. if you are a developing nation, to be able to get into a sport, acquire the number of boats, get them to your country, start developing sailors, it takes a long time. So if every 5 minutes you're changing the class, it becomes difficult. Now, I think that historically, some people in some of the positions that are trying to decide which the events are trying to move those classes to disadvantage the nations that they think are strong in those classes, and Great Britain has been one of those. Unfortunately, I think it does completely the opposite, because the reality is that those classes that are, or countries that are good at developing quickly and have the resource to do so, can move and change those disciplines and those classes quickly, and they can learn faster if they understand the process and if they have the resource in place. So I think that it's probably right to say that historically that has failed if that was the policy. So I'd probably go for a mix of both, actually. I'd say have some that have some continuity, but accept that youngsters around the developing world want to see something that's a bit different. And there is a media aspect to that. But on the other hand, that media aspect does bring with it, for some people, some great riches that allow them to continue in their sport. And they've got some fantastic stories to tell. And if you look at some of our very top athletes, Hannah Mills being one of them, she is celebrated around the world for far more than just actually being a fantastic sailor, in terms of the work that she's doing in the environment, the work she's doing to promote women's sport, and indeed within our own sport and sailing. So we shouldn't forget that aspect, and the aspect that social media brings to the world at large.
And that's good for our sport. I mean, quite often when I worked at the RWA, and still people, if they had a drink or two, would say, look, all that money should go to grassroots sport, right? Because then our sailing club, our class, our environment would be better. The simple fact is that's not available. That money has been decided because it's the UK sports, goal to win medals at the Olympics, is what it says in the charter. To say that could be, that amount of money could be redirected is pure fantasy. The other thing is that if we weren't an Olympic sport, then when little sailing club on a reservoir in the Midlands wants to build a new clubhouse or have a jetty or is fighting the local authority, whatever, the fact that one of the councillors has seen Ben Ainsley, all right, on the telly, is relatable, all right, and sports that aren't able to do that, squash, handball. Handball is. There are sports that are dying to get in, because unless you meet that threshold, it's a very easy decision by the grant givers, the planning permission givers, and all the rest of it to say, do you know what, they're not an Olympic sport, But our sailing clubs, over 1,000 of them, are able to say that. And people don't really understand the leverage that we've got that helps to give us more visibility, as well as what Sparky says about the characters involved, like you, I mean, and Ellen, I mean, this makes our sport, believable, relatable, and fundable, frankly.
But you will know more better than any of the rest of us on this call that it's not just the money that comes from UK sport. I mean, the money that comes from UK sport under the terms that it's issued from lottery from DCMS is very specifically and politically targeted. It's around inspiration through sports. It's about leveraging sports power to motivate individuals, to motivate them for feeling proud, for feeling nationalistic, for about the benefits for well-being, about the impact on society. But that also links to the funding that we get through the home country sports councils, Sport Scotland, Sport Wales, and Sport England. And when you look at the investment that those home country sports councils make in those smaller clubs, in the community investment, it almost exactly mirrors the investment that goes into the Olympic sports. So if you are one of the Olympic sports and you are doing well, people want to get on board and want to support that politically, and therefore they want to see that supported at a local level. So in turn, that investment does go to the community. It's just not as visible as it is in the first instance. And so for me, it's around trying to impact correctly with the investment. But also sailing's very fortunate. And one of the, when you go back to the points about social media, it's very fortunate because of the nature of the skills required to be successful in our sport. We have a very articulate population of athletes who are able to discuss what they're doing. They're able to talk about the challenges. They're able to talk about nature. They're able to talk about climate change. And we're able to see what goes on. And, that's quite different being, in my view, being an athlete, and I have the benefit of being able to see it in a number of different sports over the games that I've been involved in. It's quite different when you see the skills and attributes that some athletes have got in some sports with the skills and attributes that they have to have if they're going to be successful. If you're going to, whether it's, be a single-handed windsurfer out training on your own in Weymouth Bay, or as you did, sailing around the world on your own, and something goes wrong, you have to get out of it yourself. You have to sort it out. You have to work out the problem. And that gives us a very well-informed, a very aspirational population. And so if you can target those people, and you can align some visible success, then every politician in the country wants to stand up alongside them. And that's why it's important to retain it as an Olympic sport, because it's going to drive social impact.
I would support that. Sailing has taught me everything.
I think on that note, gentlemen, I could literally talk to you all night because you're so knowledgeable and so informed. But I think on that note, that's a really nice place to finish. And we missed out so many topics. But I think what we have celebrated is the power of sailing, what it can do, and just how strong a nation we are. Thank you to people like yourselves that have been involved in the sport for so long and continue to have that passion. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, and join me next week when I'll be talking to Olympic and Paralympic gold medalists about the stories that led to their success.